Robert Adams is an associate professor of architecture at Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning, with faculty appointments in the Stamp School of Art and Design and Digital Studies Institute. Additionally, Robert directs the University of Michigan Initiative on Disability Studies. Robert's research focuses on the interplay between architecture and responsive environments, disability culture, and health infrastructure. His design work prototypes spatial strategies to de-stress the workplace by enhancing a sense of well-being, social connection, and mindfulness. Robert co-founded BASE, which stands for Beijing Architecture Studio Enterprise, in 2005, and has extensive experience working in China, where he consults with disability rights organizations and collaborates with other artists and designers. Adams Gilpin Design Studio was established in Los Angeles in 1996 with his partner Don Gilpin, who also is a faculty member at the Taubman College. They are currently integrating LiDAR 3D scanning technologies to document significant works of architecture, indigenous sites, and industrial landscapes in the United States and Mexico. In order to make cultural artifacts more accessible to a broader audience through immersive, extensive reality narratives. Robert identifies as disabled, and his lecture this evening will center around disability aesthetics and design. Please join me in welcoming Robert Adams.
Thanks, man. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming out this afternoon. This is really impressive. I'm so looking forward to getting to know you a little bit. Thank you, Zach, for the invitation, for organizing this, and your generous introduction. It's really nice to see Professor David Carley. We worked together on a project that I'll show you a little bit later in this talk. So it's really nice to reconnect with you. So I'm going to take you, I'm thinking of this talk as a series of meditations, like meditations or meta, M-E-T-A, meditations on disability aesthetics. And so I'll go through, I'll kind of clarify some of the terms I'm using and give you a sense of what disability studies is and thinking about the interplay between discourses in disability study and how they might arrest ways of thinking about architecture. So the name of the talk is Criptographies, and Criptographies is really just a word play. It's a word play on the term cryptography, which is the study of ciphers and secret codes, but it's also the word crip, which is used amongst the disability community, amongst disabled comrades, as a way of empowering space, empowering ourselves in space. And it's derived from the derogatory word. Cryptographies are spatial narratives that claim political space for disability culture to flourish. So what's at stake? So I'm interested in sort of telling you a little bit about disability studies and disability aesthetics as both conceptual and critical frameworks to intercept the city, especially when we think of things like biopolitics, as it correlates to various bodies, and by bodies I mean that writ large, so like human bodies, historical bodies, bodies of knowledge and philosophy, architectural, spatial, and urban bodies, and for sure like performative and representational bodies. You'll notice in some moments in this talk the alignment or sometimes misalignment between what I'm saying and what's written, and then what the image is in the background, and I'll try to make sense out of all of that. So the image in the background, you might recall a couple of years ago, or maybe it was just last year, this large balloon floated over, it drifted over the Pacific, up over Alaska, came down through Canada. It might even drifted like partly over Nebraska here. And it was determined by the US Air Force as a Chinese surveillance balloon. And it was drifting ever so slowly, like undetected. It wasn't deemed a threat until eventually it was shot down over the ocean on the East Coast. So this is something that I'm calling disability aesthetics at the scale of the territory or at the scale of geopolitics. So maybe in some classes here, you might have instructors who issue things like trigger warnings. So I'm not going to call it trigger warning because the word trigger is already triggering enough for me. So I think about like a soft intro into some of the content. So I want you to be aware. We'll get into some of the work I've been doing in China over the years. I'll introduce you to a few artists that I've worked with and other designers. And this document, it contains images of some kind of difficult subject matter. It's not meant to be off-putting to anybody, but it is meant to provoke a position, provoke a reaction, and to get you thinking about things. So there's some images that involve police violence, skeletal remains from an archaeological site. There's a bit on architecturally assisted suicide, nudity, medical images, performance art, some surgical procedures, and other exquisite bodies. These are all necessary, I think, to build out the aesthetic range of disability. The image in the background is a crematorium in Mexico City during the COVID pandemic in 2020. So, I identify as disabled. I have muscular dystrophy. The long word is facioscapular humeral dystrophy. It's a muscle wasting disease that affects the face, usually upper arms. It really messes with your entire biomechanics. And it's a progressive disease, and there's like no cure for it or anything like that. So that's been something that factors into how I think. I also am somebody who is challenged at times with pretty serious depression and anxiety. I used to be a drug addict. I was addicted to opioids for a number of years. I don't have any opioids on board right now. But let's just say like my commitment to the disability space and how our bodies are pathologized and medicalized is something that I have a deep sense of commitment to and respect for. So I'll introduce, some things about disability culture and architecture. Let's say way beyond, I hope, the usual normative demands from, by architects whenever disability moves into the room. Like you think, if we just make the building accessible, or if we use things like universal design, we've got all bases covered, and I'm arguing that that's barely scratching the surface. So my objective here is to really reposition the aesthetics of disability within the architectural and urban imaginary by suggesting that the social body or urban body is never homogeneous or a complete object, but rather a heterogeneous, indefinite composition of broken disruptions, fractures, and I'm using this word crip, relationships. So a few years ago, I invented this new word. So you've heard of the Holocene? Anybody study geology? No, somebody, geology. So if you know something about geological deep time and the history of deep time, the period of the Holocene, which is what we're in right now, let's say we're at the end of the Holocene, it's approximately the last 10,000 years of geological history. So arguably, a lot of human stuff going on. The apex predator in the Holocene is the Homo sapiens, right? The Homo sapiens, the direct translation from the Greek or Latin, Homo sapiens directly translates to wise man, wise man. For me, that's incredibly problematic, as is the Holocene. So now there's John Crutzen and a number of other people are talking about this current epoch that we're in, geological epoch. Some people call it the Anthropocene. You've probably heard of that. So it's the degree to which human production has like transformed the entire planet as if it's an ice age, as if it's a major geological event. And so I thought like with this geological turn, as some people refer to it, from the Holocene to the Anthropocene or the Chthulucene or other kinds of scenes, that maybe the naming conventions around how we identify the human body would also change. So I was thinking about this new term that I'm trying to put into circulation amongst young people, that what if we started referring to ourselves as chromo sapiens? And I want to pull that word chromo out for both like the spectral, the color spectrum, but also chrome, like chrome plating and chromium, the chromium products, metallurgy, chrome bumpers, the degree to which things like heavy metals are invested in our bodies. And I think this new term chromo sapien is fitting in that regard. How many of you had like a scrambled eggs this morning or a pancake? Yeah, you had some eggs. Did you cook it on a Teflon skillet, like a non-stick skillet? How many of you use Teflon skillets? Almost every kitchen has a Teflon non-stick skillet, right? It was invented by our friends at Dow Chemical, just in Michigan, a little bit further north from where I currently live. And Dow Chemical put Teflon on skillets to make your pancakes and eggs slip off it nicely. And it's a really beautiful product. It does that efficiently, really well. About 95% of people around the world are using Teflon-coated cookware. And as a result, if you were to draw and take a blood test and analyze the blood, you would find trace amounts of Teflon in your body. Almost the entire population of the human race has Teflon in its body, and it's measurable. So the degrees to which the environment itself sort of gets ingested into our bodies would suggest that our bodies are not determinate things, or we're not as individuated as we might think, but we're connected to a series of larger networks, material flows, and so forth. So just so you know a bit where I'm coming from, so I think architecture, lots of people have done definitions of architecture, but I think of architecture more as like a communication medium. I'm interested in how architecture develops things like the relational structuring of complexity through material and spatial means, and how design is really an organizational practice that navigates prototypes and delivers complex world building. So I think of design in my studio, my teaching is like a form of research, just like a conventional scholar might do research and write a book. And I'm also interested in this term of complex worlding, and I would argue that the world we're in right now is complicated. If you read the news or you witness what's going around the world, it's really complicated and complex. And I think in schools of architecture, but also other disciplines, we need to develop research methodologies and methods of engagement that are equally as complex in order to de-simplify the reductive tendencies of architectural education. So my polemic, the kind of key question that keeps me up at night, is really thinking through architecture as a platform to engage the politics of space. And so the politics of space question is really focused on what does the process of making, unmaking, and remaking tell us about the cultures we presume to produce, or at least participate within. If you're an architect, you're designing things, you're also partly responsible for producing the cultural parameters around a wide range of practices. So, in this sense, disability is an ideal context to study the dynamics, let's say the process of making, unmaking, and remaking, and the trauma of making, unmaking, and remaking across a range of scales. So the image in the background is obviously Pruitt-Igoe, very famous social housing block designed by Yamasaki and Associates. It opened up to great fanfare, and with less than a decade, it failed in terms of its social experiment, and the building was unmade or demolished. So if there's one thing you take away from this talk, this will be the one thing. And if you get this, it'll be potentially a life-changing thing, I think. It was for me. So, when you see somebody who's disabled, or maybe you yourself identify as disabled, or maybe you have a family member or a friend who's disabled, I think generally people perceive disabled people as, wow, that's got to be such a hard life. What a struggle, what a financial burden. How much pain do you have to endure? You know, these kinds of tropes around disability as a life of hardship, pain, and struggle. And I want to flip that script. So what if we thought of disability as it's allied with a lot of other minority discourses? The disability itself produces unique types of knowledge that are essential to how we think about social construction, you know, and meaning in life. So really, disability studies, it develops discourses around human embodiment, alterity or difference within difference, and specifically complex intersectionality, right? That's the way that we all identify based on our race, ethnicity, religious beliefs, social class, economic status, genders, sexual orientations, you know, and you know, you name it. And all those things wind up and they make us as intersectional people. So that's another thing I would add into, like, I think the more we understand our own intersectionality, the more we should demand an equally intersectional architecture. So disability studies is allied with things like indigenous studies, racial studies, gender studies, and it cares for how social identities are formed, exchanged, and promote cultural value. That said, if you look at a university, so let's take Nebraska as an example, Michigan's not dissimilar, large R1 research organization. If you look at how disability is rendered in the research flow of the organization, on one end you have like physicians and healthcare workers who understand disability as like it's a disease, it's an ontological object to be diagnosed, therapies need to be created for it, it needs to be ameliorated, drug regimens are sort of added on to suppress disability, and ultimately, this is not true for all physicians, but ultimately there's this idea that if we could cure ourselves of disability, we would be a much more healthy society. I'll get to that, I'll get back to that a little bit later. And then if you look at the engineering sciences and things like rehab engineering, disability is understood as a problem to be solved through technological means, right? So that's the whole world of why do assistive devices like powered wheelchairs, canes, crutches, all the gear that, you know, all the tech that gets wrapped up in disability looks the way it does. It's because it's completely over-engineered, right? So there's nothing about like the style of that thing that's part of your identity. It's this engineering, problem-solving, you know, agenda. In architecture, as I alluded to earlier, disability moves in the room. In architecture, they think it's all about like just make it accessible. Got to have the ramps, you know, zero threshold, and then architects seem to be happy with that. The humanities, which I feel more aligned with, think of disability as a cultural practice, right? That produces unique types of knowledge, and so there's a whole thing around disability in art production, disability in performance studies, and it gets animated in that way. What's cool about disability studies is that it levels really sharp critiques at the medical sciences and engineering spaces. And the history of disability and the history of those programs have waged a kind of war and genocide and used disabled people as human test subjects to advance medicine or biomedicine. And I want to suggest that that is changing, but it's only been recently, like within the last 50 years, that that position is starting to evolve to a more informed state. So collectively, these ableist models, by ableist I mean how able bodies, normative bodies, often understand their position as superior over disabled bodies. So disability studies challenges all these kinds of domains. So just a few quick things here. How is disability understood as a facet of intersectional identity? And I think my critique of disability studies within the humanities is that maybe it's a little bit too anchored in the human-centric narrative. So what do I mean by that? So my friend Tobin Siebers, disability studies scholar, talks a lot about human embodiment as part of the lived experience of disability, and through one's lived experience, you come to know things, right? Know things in a way that you can communicate that knowledge to others. And so if you think of disability as a creative practice that produces unique types of knowledge, from a human embodiment perspective, could that idea scale up? Could a city be considered disabled? Could a building or landscape be considered disabled? And if you scale it way out, could you think about like the planetary status of a disabled planet? And then things like global climate change move into that space, and arguably we are in a kind of crip geopolitical condition, a geo-environmental space through a disability perspective. So can entire worlds themselves be disabled? So disability aesthetics, it really arrests normative views on beauty. Disability is not a neutral way of being in the world, and neither is its representation. So the aesthetic range of disability can be both like traumatic but also euphoric. And how might we discover through disability new forms of pleasure, especially in spaces where pleasure itself seems completely unavailable? So my friend Taubman Siebers, he wrote two really big books, one called Disability Aesthetics, another one called Disability Theory. It's sort of his way of like owning that entire space. It's very bold, but they're really good books if you're interested in picking up on this. And he made this really interesting claim in Disability Aesthetics that disability somehow factors into all critical art production. The book is biased towards the so-called avant-garde practices globally. And when you start looking at creative critical art practices globally, almost within a few like traverses in that space, you'll pick up on a kind of disability-informed project. So more precisely, disability aesthetics tracks the emotions that some bodies feel, let's say normative bodies feel, but cannot comprehend in the presence of disability. You're walking down the street. You see somebody in a powered wheelchair whiz by you. They're moving at twice the rate you are. That arrests the scene. You cannot help but not notice that person, right? So disability sort of like punctures social space in that way. So disability aesthetics, it prizes this kind of physical and mental difference as a significant value in and of itself. It's anytime you feel like something, you feel that funny hair on the back of your neck stick up for whatever reason. It could be you encounter somebody from a different race, somebody from a different gender, and you feel that strange, like, are we connected? We're connected, aren't we, right? We're connected, we're all humans. But it's that kind of feeling that disability aesthetics really operates within. So here's a didactic object lesson in disability tactics. So this is a Han Dynasty vase. I like to say vase. Sounds more real. It's from Han Dynasty China. So it's an object. It's over 2,000 years old. And you can say some really basic things about this object. It has bilateral symmetry. It's well proportioned. It has a nice, little bit of an adornment, ornamental figure here. You can see the grooves moving around it, so you get the idea that this is a handmade object. It's a prized possession. It was somehow procured by the Metropolitan Museum of Art and was valued. This is 20 years ago, so its value has changed dramatically since then. But it was valued at the time as a $1.1 million art object. So when we were in Beijing, a friend of ours, Ai Weiwei, who's a really well-known Chinese artist, he's now in the UK practicing. Early on in his career, he procured this vase. So here's Ai Weiwei holding the vase. So I'm calling this an idealized object, let's say a normative object that's been radically repositioned. So he drops a $1.1 million object and it shatters on the ground. All the art historians have an absolute fit. The cultural curators accuse him of like treason and so on. And so is this action justified, right? And what this did for Ai Weiwei is it put the guy on the map, right? He did something so radical that it really, he broke the taboo. He broke the cultural norm. And so that's where I'm interested in, like, when idealized forms, in this case it's just a vase, right? How might they, when they're dismantled, how might they volunteer counter-narratives that open up the possibility of entirely new modes of representation and cultural value? So we were at Weiwei's studio, a group of students, and my friend Robert Mangurian, and Ai Weiwei said, in the West, you teach people how to become superpowers, and in the East, we teach people how to become people.
Is it wickedness? Is it weakness? You decide. Are we gonna live or die?
So I was taking a walk the other day, and I seen a woman, a blind woman, pacing up and down the sidewalk. She seemed to be a bit frustrated, as if she had dropped something and having a hard time finding it. So after watching her struggle for a while, I decided to go over and lend a helping hand, Hello, ma'am. Can I be of any assistance? Seems to me that you have lost something. I would like to help you find it. She replied, oh yes, you have lost something. You've lost your life.
Is it wickedness?
Maybe some of you recognize this amazing song on an equally amazing album by Pulitzer Prize winning artist Kendrick Lamar. It's the opening track on Damn, called Blood. And the second piece, he follows up this track with DNA, right? And so let's just go through this narrative really quick. I mean, it's pretty clear. He's talking about, he sees a woman walking on the street, looks like a blind woman. He assumes like this person might need some help. Or the narrator. We don't know who the narrator is. Is it Kendrick Lamar? Is it somebody else? Is it an entire group of people? We don't know precisely the autonomy of the narrator. But he perceives this somebody, a blind person, and sees that as an object that needs help, right? This is a really complex narrative that Lamar is winding up here, because it cuts like in 5 or 6 different directions simultaneously. And so, like a good citizen, wants to go help the person. Maybe she's lost, she can't find her way. And so he's going to go ask, do you need a help? Can I do anything for you? It's a compassionate, empathetic way of being a citizen on the street. And then the plot twist here is the blind woman now becomes the assassin, right? Becomes the person who murders the narrator. Now, there's been a lot of discourse and talk about, like, what's the meaning behind this? What are the metaphors involved? But I think it speaks volume to the mythological construction of Lady Justice, so-called Lady Justice, as a blind figure. When in fact, if you look at the justice system within the United States, it's just a weapon of state power that perpetuates structural racism and ableism And we need to disrupt that process. And I think disability, to disable the justice system, that it's a kind of disabled organization, I think is an interesting way of flipping the scripts around compassion, empathy, and care, and what's at stake in this space. So these next couple of images talk about a little bit of police violence against black men in particular. So what's at stake? This is 3 images from video surveillance footage, 2015. 3 police officers murder Mr. Jeremy McDowell, Wilmington. He's obviously, you can see Mr. McDowell on the left here, he's behind a car. He's in a manual wheelchair, he's a paraplegic, he can't walk. He had a gun. So he allegedly had a weapon. He wasn't using that weapon. His hands weren't even on the weapon. And nonetheless, this thing of like the disability aesthetics, when normative bodies feel threatened by disabled bodies and they can't comprehend what's going on, so they decide to take action as a perceived threat and act on that in the most lethal way. So 1 officer shoots Mr. McDowell, and then 2 other officers, he's shot multiple times, a man in a wheelchair, and then he dies there on the spot. The officers clearly murdered Mr. McDowell, yet none was charged with murder in this case. We know the story of the police waging a campaign of genocide against black people, black and brown people. But what the media isn't speaking about in a more direct way is that about 50% of the people killed by the police annually are also disabled. So this is this intersectional, right? It's one thing to be black or brown, and then black and brown or trans, and then disabled, all these things. I think there's something about like the higher amplitude of your intersectionality suggests that the higher rate of lethality and the likelihood of a lethal outcome is increasing as a result. Here's case 2. This is the murder of Mr. George Floyd. I grew up just a few blocks from this site, South Minneapolis. So let's go back and just review some of the case of the prosecution and defense with Chauvin, who was charged with the crime of murder. And it's true. So medical experts called by the prosecution have said that low oxygen levels caused by the restraint were the cause of Mr. Floyd's death. That is very clear. Chauvin's defense suggested that Floyd's heart condition and alleged drug addiction were primary factors in Mr. Floyd's death. False. The defense witness, a physician, Dr. David Fowler, who I hope his license has been removed, stated that fentanyl and methamphetamine contributed to Floyd's death. He also said that there's an exposure to vehicle exhaust, so potentially carbon monoxide poisoning, or at least an effect from increased carbon monoxide poisoning in his bloodstream contributed to his death. So what was happening here is the defense tried to attribute Mr. Floyd's death to his disability, his addiction, and an environmental threat, when in fact it was a brutal murder. So let's just say disability. Disability isn't a human embodiment. Disability is absolutely designed through a process of systemic human disqualification when normal bodies feel, threatened by disabled bodies. And so how do we get here? Why are we in the way we are today? It's the 21st century, right? The deep history of disability is profoundly traumatic, and so is the current state that we're in. So maybe some of you have read the philosophies of Plato and Aristotle, Greek philosophers. You've certainly heard from them. And so one day, they're both like student and teachers. So Plato's the older, white-haired beard guy on the left, Aristotle's the younger student on the right. And one day they're holding hands walking in the Athenian Agora, and they're having a very meaningful conversation about, what does it mean to be a human being? What constitutes a human being? And how do you know if you're a human being or not? And so they came up with some really short, brief criteria. Well, they said, first, you have to be an adult. So if you're a kid, you're not quite, you're sort of a human, you're a subhuman, but not human enough to be called a human, so you don't count. If you're a slave, you're not human. If you're male versus female, if you're male, you're a little bit more human than female. It helped if you were physically fit, if you had your rational, intellectual faculties intact, right? So if you could be a rational thinking person who's well fit and good looking, maybe easy on the eyes, and male, then that's what it means to be a human being. So what's really happening here? So Elder Plato says, well, what about, disabled people? He says, the offspring, and this is part of the written record, but doesn't get talked about in Aristotelian scholarship. Plato says, the offspring of the inferior, or better when they chance to be deformed, shall be put away. Let's just disappear the disabled people, disappear the non-humans. And then like a good student, Aristotle says, wait, I've got a better idea. He says, please let me expand upon that point. Let there be a law that no deformed child shall live. This is the forensic evidence of Plato and Aristotle's policy measures and value system. This is a trash site. It's just a few miles outside the Athenian Agora, brilliantly excavated by Maria Liston, a biological anthropologist from University of Waterloo, Canada. This is the forensic evidence. So this is near a river delta. The team determined that there were 450 dead infants, including slaves, some which were shackled, the skeletons of adults with notable physical deformity, and 150 dogs and puppies. In other words, these were non-human actors, animals, treated like animals, disposed of like trash, without ceremony, without recognition, any identity or ritual. But here's the rub. Like that was also connected to the idea of the city, right? The idea of Plato's Republic and its impact on Western thought for things like democracy is part of the larger eugenics mission about how some bodies prioritize themselves over others. So let's just take that through, let's fast forward that, 1,500 years, 2,000 years or so into, let's say, the Italian Renaissance. That plays a role in architectural education, I hear. So urban eugenics are practices that eradicate disability as blight and play a prominent role in modern city planning. So here's a drawing at the right. It's kind of the ideal city by the Renaissance architect Francesco di Giorgio. And it's kind of an amazing drawing, right? You see the city inscribed, the body is inscribed in the city, and like that ideal Han Dynasty vase, all the descriptive language of Plato and Aristotle's like caught up in the iconography here, right? So you have a young, masculine, easy on the eyes, male, upright, wearing a crown which holds like the head, prioritizes the head over the body. That's the dominant figure. And it corresponds with the city, point for point. So the erasure, I would say, of disability has always been part of architecture's core agenda. And I would argue like smart cities rhetoric are just weapons of urban ableism. And the modern concept of the city is a serious problem. So let's look parallel to that, other representational strategies and descriptions of the city. So this painting, it's one of three. It's a triptych called Ideal Cities. The art historians are arguing about like who painted it. We'll just say somebody did. Piero della Francesca was thought to be the painter, but maybe it's one of his studio mates, who knows. So the ideal city, what can you say about this city? Notice anything about it immediately? I mean, it has all the things of the Athenian agora, right? It's upright, it has bilateral symmetry, architecture is properly framing itself, staging itself. The ideal city, it's evacuated from all human presence, right? So this could be an image of like Milan or Bergamo, Italy, in northern Italy, which was just eviscerated during the pandemic. Kind of the city is totally emptied out of all its occupation in its idealized or more normative form. So I started looking at these triptychs because these played a factor in terms of how people thought about what the city should be like. You know, the new image for the city, how do you clean it out? So here's an image. I thought this character is really curious. It kind of breaks the modern scene, right? This is a person with a cane, he's got a suitcase, but he's moving through the scene. So disability sort of breaks the representational strategy of the modern city, but then the disabled actor itself is just merely passing through it, not staying there like the people in the background here. They're doing proper civic discourse. They're having conversation, yet the disabled actor is kind of moving through it. It's also the only human figure in this painting that casts a shadow. None of the other figures cast a shadow. And so I was thinking in sort of my way, like maybe there's something about casting a shadow of doubt metaphorically on the modern city project through a disability actor moving through the scene. As opposed to this scene, same time period by Pietro Bruegel the Elder. You know, here architecture is not the buildings, it's the spectacle of the society, you know, people doing stuff. And I really love this. There's a cast of 3 characters here, a couple guys on crutches, and this one person using these crawling sticks, you know, to move through the city. Sort of like low-tech assistive devices, crawling through the city, perceiving the city, but not isolated from it, not like evicted from it or marginalized, like part of the scene. And I think it's like totally brilliant that this is the fight between Carnival and Lent, that Bruegel includes like the madness of the city. And I mean that both neurologically and also like the madness around like Carnival and Lent. This next image, we'll talk about suicide. So let's go back to the early example, the Han Dynasty vase. Let's go back to Francesco de Giorgio, the idealized body inscribed in the idealized city. And here we have the vessel. 21st century, Hudson Yards, Thomas Heatherwick, 2016, founded by a guy who gave a lot of money to our university, University of Michigan, graduate of the university. So this is the vessel, maybe some of you have seen this. Rises 16 stories and consists of 154 flights of stairs, 2,500 steps, and 80 landings for visitors to climb. The public had to pay when it initially opened $10 as an entrance fee. And photography for any financial gain was prohibited and policed. So this is a $200 million ableist machine designed to exclude and disqualify disabled persons, and more so, anyone not in the money game of late capital, right? So you just couldn't go there. You were policed. You were sort of like gatekept, you know, both physically and psychologically to access this site. Clearly, like disability rights activists leveled a really sharp critique of its accessibility. The developer and Heatherwick said, okay, we'll put in an elevator, but the elevator only goes to like the ground level, the third, and like the top floor. And then somebody jumped. And then a month later, another person jumped, and they shut it down. And they opened it back up again. They stopped charging $10, so it was free. And then 2 more people jumped. So using this vessel to commit architecturally assisted suicide. And my question to you would be, should the architect be held liable? And I think he should, actually, and the developer. So Criptographies, this is disability aesthetics, right? Flips the pathological narrative of architecture by promoting speculative work for a more equitable, inclusive, and I hope a more responsive and responsible architecture. I'm going to kind of skip through this just lightly. So 2007, leading up to the Beijing Winter or the Beijing Summer Olympics, the city's on fire. Lots of architects and urban planners and urbanists talking about the DNA of the city, and that the DNA of Beijing was the hutong, the traditional courtyard structure. Beautiful, like Ming Dynasty, 600, 700, 800-year-old buildings. High density, but super intricate and amazing, like everyday life kind of flipped inside and outside of that space. But the Olympics had to come to town, and they had to make space to run the Olympic marathon. So I was living kind of just down to the right here at the time. And so, every day I'd ride my bike. It was back then it was like a completely like biking city and amazing in that way. But you can see like along the second ring road, the Bird's Nest Stadium is up here. Olympic Villages is up there. And then this is the leading edge of these hutong courtyard structures. And so the city planning officials said, we have to make room to run the Olympic marathon. So we're gonna like do something here. And so what they did is they committed an act of what I'm calling disabling tactics of demolition, or some architects use the word urban acupuncture. So to make space for the marathon, demolition teams went to this site. People are still living in the buildings. And the city said, you have to move out. People aren't going to move out. They've lived there for generations. Why would you move out? And so the demolition crews went in with jackhammers, sledgehammers, and other implements of destruction. And they didn't just start at one end and start, just taking it down and gradually pushing people out. They went in with 10 teams. They went right to the kitchen, lobotomized that, right to the bathroom, took that out, and quickly rendered those structures uninhabitable, forcing people to leave. And there was a big protest around this. Some people were arrested. One person was killed during this confrontation. So this strategy of a kind of control, alt, delete urbanism to disable the space so that able, elite bodies could outrun the slow city, I think is what's going on here. I'm gonna brush over this one just quickly. Work with a good friend, we collaborated on this project. Here's a historical drawing, The Bloodstained Shirt by Wan Shiko. Talks about property rights in the early formation of modern China. Wan Song, the artist, some of his work, he'll look at a historic artifact and then sort of restage that through photography. So we restaged the Bloodstained Shirt in Detroit. This is a factory in ruin in Detroit, working with a number of people from the community there to restage this scene. Another artist that I want to introduce you to is He Yongcheng. So this next image includes an interesting story about surgery. So the project was Ah-Chung, as he goes by, he's the most peaceful person I've ever met in my life. If you were to walk into the room, you would barely see him, but you could feel his presence, one of these kinds of people. And every year he does one performance. He's a performance artist, probably China's most famous performance artist. And sometimes the performances are somewhat dramatic. So for example, this performance piece, that's actually one of his ribs that he had surgically removed and cut out of him and then put into this kind of necklace, this golden dragon necklace. And in the next scene, the setup was he invited 20 of his friends to go to a gallery. There's a bed in the gallery, and his surgeon, volunteer surgeon, it's his personal surgeon because she's the only person that agrees to work with him on his projects. And so he said, I'm going to make the proposal, and then we're going to vote whether or not I should do the performance or not. And so he pitched it, and 10 people said, no, don't do it. 10 people said yes, but he's the artist, so the deciding vote, so he decides to do it. So he takes off all his clothes, lays down on the bed. The surgeon pulls out a scalpel, cleans his body, and then makes a cut from the top of his neck, the nape of his neck, down his body to his upper thigh, exactly 1 meter long. The piece is called 1 Meter for Democracy. It helps if you know a little bit about the geopolitical context of where he's working, right? If you think about, you probably know Xi Jinping leadership, maybe a little bit about the history, Tiananmen Square, June 4th, 1989, student democracy movement, etc. So this is what Ah Chung does. So this is another performance. Walks into a museum gallery, the atrium, just wearing simple pajamas, has a handful of lighters, and then burns all his clothes off his body until he's just covered in soot and ash and burns. This is 1 year after Alicia Keys releases Girl on Fire. He's now Man on Fire. It's the same moment when Tibetan monks were self-immolating themselves, sacrificing themselves in Tiananmen Square in protest against the state. More recent performance piece, bodies during COVID in Beijing were stacking up, so he placed himself alongside them in a body bag with a painted on black mask, and then I think his dangerous supplement is he has a cigarette. So we spent a lot of time with Ah Chung, and so one day we were talking, and I said, you know, we're doing this stuff with LiDAR scanning, and can we scan your body? And he said, yeah, let's do it. And so we got a LiDAR scanner with photogrammetry. We spent a few hours scanning his body. We took that digital surface, the photogrammetry, and unrolled it with some software to make this kind of tapestry, a kind of map. And I think like this map, in contrast to the Francesco di Giorgio, is a more accurate cartography of the trauma and euphoria of Beijing at that point in time. Like it's a much more accurate description of this idea of the disabled body being, corresponding, being as it is inscribed within the city. Now it's as if the city is being reinscribed back onto the body. What is the process of making and unmaking and remaking? Tell us about the cultures we want to produce. When I'm going to do a kind of lateral jump cut now, we're going to the hospital. The place where if you're sick or if you're ill, it's a place of healing. You want to be cared for. And this is the environment that we're asked to participate in, right? That is the architecture of the hospital. It's not just like the white walls, that kind of chemical, antimicrobial, countermeasured scent in the air. It's really like the apparatus of this entire monopoly in biomedicine that's investing itself deeply into our bodies. So we scanned, that was a cardiovascular unit. That's a 3D LiDAR point cloud from that work. How's everybody doing? Good? Just a few more minutes here. All right, so through the course of my time, over the last 10 years or so, I've been working on design, strategy, and thinking differently about architecture as a result of experiencing my own body. I've had about 10 major surgical procedures in the last 5 years. I'm very much a Chromo sapien, very committed to the medical project, but also not aligned with it and a strong critic of it. And so David was part of this team, David Carley, was part of the team, and we developed this project called the Aesclepius machine. And so Aesclepius, it's a reference to the Greeks in Greek mythology. Aesclepius is the Greek god of the medical arts. And so the short description of this project is it's just a tricked out wheelchair ramp. That's all it is. It's kind of a tricked out wheelchair ramp. So when we were coming into the building earlier today, Zach and I noticed like the stainless steel wheelchair ramp, 30 feet landing, 30 feet landing, you know, doing all this stuff, being compliant. It's accessible, made the building accessible. That's usually how it plays out. I wanted to take things on like that interstitial space between public domain and institutional domain and like work on that as a site, because no one else is doing that. Like the architects are invested in the building. Sometimes there's some landscape stuff going on that can be interesting, usually not, and then it's engineered. It's like traffic, you know, engineering, pedestrian stuff, you know, cars, etc. But it's that funny space that when you get out of bed in the morning and you leave wherever you're sleeping and you end up at work or school, it's that kind of space that I'm interested in. Neither one, but in particular I was thinking about going to the hospital, a place that should care for you, but when you go there, it's a little bit like going to architecture school. As soon as I step through the doors of the architecture building, I get triggered, like I can't stand it, and I start to sweat, and I get nervous. And so how do you lessen that stress, right? And that's, architecture can de-stress these environments if we allow it. So I went back to the body, I went back to Francesco de Giorgio, I went back to the Chromo Sapien. I started looking at like, okay, I'm gonna design a wheelchair ramp, but I'm gonna put like 500% of my design energy into something that never gets even 10% design energy, just as an experiment. And so I started, you know, collecting biomedical imaging. So this is a young woman that has a total spinal fusion. So again, you can see like the investment of the medical apparatus intensively invading the body in order to stabilize the spine. And I was working with radiologists, X-ray techs, patients, you know, just getting invested in the representational organization of that kind of space. And so this is a prototypical project. It's meant to have different kinds of application types, but this particular version is really invested in a children's hospital, right? So it's playing off the scenario, young kid has to go to the hospital, what do you do about that? So the ramp on the left downstream side is fairly open. You can see it here in the section. You move up it. At the landing, there's this clothoid loop. A clothoid is sometimes it's called the Euler's spiral. What's interesting about the clothoid is it's not just a cylindrical loop. It actually has a very asymmetrical kind of force geometry placed onto it that has higher degrees in compression and decompression. And the geometry came out of the mathematics around like acceleration and deceleration of bodies in motion. And then as you move up the ramp, so you go underneath this loop space, and then you move up into this arcade space, and there's a series of pneumatic artificial muscles that as you move through the infrared field, it triggers this thing and it kind of billows up and shuts down, you know, as you move through it. There's a soundscape, there's a low vibration transducer on the floor so that people who have low vision or maybe are blind, they can feel the space. You can hear the space, you can see it, and you know, when you move through it, it moves with you. Almost like a kind of peristaltic action. And here it is, you know, being mapped onto that body. So again, really just trying to challenge this idea of architecture and its fitness relative to the human body. I'm interested in like, can you crip an architecture through disability and organize that in a way that's structural and performative. So this is just the ramp unto itself. I had the opportunity to work with Robbie Linkner, he's now the lead designer at Toyota. So we were working on this is like an early version of Digital Project / CATIA. It looks really simple, but we invested like a ton of time into trying to figure out how the geometry should compress and release, and just over-invested in something that never gets invested in at all. But I was really interested in how, like, when you move through a space of compression and then it opens up, it gives you just that slight emotional lift, right? You've seen that if you've been in an amazing work of architecture. Like, just for a moment, you feel like the weight of something shift. And the weight I'm trying to change in this is the kind of experiential and perceptual weight. So when you see somebody in a powered wheelchair, they might weigh 80 pounds, the wheelchair weighs 350 pounds. That's a kind of heavy object. It has a lot of gravity around it. And so how do you begin to strip conceptual weight out of complex ontological objects like disability and technology through architecture? So what you're seeing here is we're working on a prototype. You can see the physical model in the midground here. There's a disabled person who's in a powered wheelchair, and she's holding just a stick that has like a white ball at the end. And there's, in front of the screen, there's an infrared field. It's similar to the thing at the grocery store, right? When you were a kid, you'd put your hand in the infrared field, the doors would open, and then you'd pull it back, and you'd do that 5 or 6 times, and your parents would say, knock it off. But it was kind of fun, right? That's the kind of responsive architecture I'm into. So in this, as the ball is moving through the space, it's activating the infrared field, which is lighting up the ramp. You can see the LED lights there. And then it's also coordinated to the video animation. So you're able to kind of scrub back and forth in the animation itself. There's a soundscape to it. And I'm interested in that kind of architectural space that's both physical and digital. It's immersive, it's performative. And that's kind of the space I want to live in. This is a very early video of the very first prototype model. The model's about 3 meters long. It has a scuba tank of compressed air. These orange things are the pneumatic muscles. There's some force capacitance sensors on it, so when you press the sensor, you can play it like a piano and get it to activate. And this is the just scanning through the elevation, so you can see the muscles are triggering the fins. And now we're as if we're going up the ramp. So you go from a like public space, the bus stop sidewalk, into a higher degree of enclosure. You hear the sound of the muscles being triggered. There's nitrous oxide that's built into it. The atmosphere is slightly oxygenated. Oop. There we go. So as I said, I've been pretty invested in the medical space. And so one day my daughter and I, we were in a doctor's appointment. It's the usual thing. You go in, you wait in a room for waiting, and then you go to a smaller room to wait for the doctor. That takes another hour. And we were getting really bored. And so I said, wow, I wonder what's in these drawers? What's in the cabinet here? And so I found this piece of titanium that's an artificial hip replacement, and I put it in my pocket, and I took it. And then every appointment, and we've probably had 100 appointments over the years, every time I go to the doctor's office, I steal one thing. Nothing that's anyone's going to miss. It's not no one's going to die because of this minor act of theft. But it became our sort of way, and Celeste was younger at the time, and so it was kind of a thing we did to get together to kill time waiting, but also a bit to kind of like dig back at it. And that collection, I started photographing all these objects, and they're kind of amazing in their material qualities. And I thought, what if we could harvest like the aesthetic properties of all these medicalized objects and put them into an architecture such that, just like in literary foreshadowing, if you were to experience this space, you would get a sense of what's to come. All right, so you're going to go visit, your uncle during COVID, and he's on a respirator, and you're a young person. And you hear your uncle on the respirator, and it's the most mechanized breath, right? Incredibly abstract. How do you explain that to a young person? And so I was thinking, like, if you had something like this funny machine, and you could understand, like, when you moved, it would breathe and open up, and you would have agency over that thing, it might begin to sensitize you to the world of abstraction that you're going to be going into in the next, 30 seconds from now, you're going to be in a completely different world. And so I was thinking about, like, how do we kind of profile the aesthetic range of the ramp to begin to wind up things that were further downstream. Oop. This is placing the ramp in the urban infrastructure of Beijing, and it's my attempt to begin, like, what if we were to start to normalize, and there'd be some sort of adoptive technique to bring structures like this into civic space as a way of disrupting the normative kinds of spaces that we have to endure the sort of slow violence of architecture within. So, in a world of increasing complexity, instability, and arguably more precarious, and I'm not using precarious as an academic, the world we're in the midst of a very slow violence at so many levels, slow and fast. I guess my question is, what practice of public life remains durable and which have yet to be encountered? I would like to believe that the forms, practices, and ethics motivated by disability frameworks, or what I call cryptographies, are emerging and help navigate the near-now future with greater equity, inclusion, but those words to me are sort of meaningless, but I think I'm interested in expanding the range of beauty. Like, the sole purpose of your education is to put you on the path towards beauty. Elaine Scarry, on beauty and being just. So when someone says, why are you going to school? And you say, well, because I want to get licensed to be an architect. I say, well, good for you. And then what? You've got your license, you've got your degree, and then what? You're an architect. Okay, what's going to keep you getting up? How do you get out of bed the next day? Well, I'm going to make some money. Good for you. And then what? What is the deep structural drive of why you do what you do? I like meeting you, the gentleman in the front. You said you're the oldest student here. And then I asked you why you went to school, and you said, because I had a dream. That's what I'm talking about. So, by increasing encounters in disability, design produces a more plural, I hope a lot more queer, and heterogeneous city with greater capacity to hold and respect simultaneity without the collapse of difference, while maintaining the right to practice civic space vividly. Thank you.
「
I know that got a little long in the jaw there. I was
No.
going to do something shorter, but I didn't have enough time, so I did something longer.
No, not at all. Thank you again for a wonderful lecture. I, personally feel a little bit blown away by the kind of intellectual fire hose of information that you were presenting. So I hope there were questions from the audience that can speak to some of the issues that were presented. And in fact, I maybe am selfishly hoping there are questions from the audience because as the person who's charged with standing up here.
Any question is fine, right?
Well, as the person who's charged with standing up here with the microphone, I'm supposed to come up with questions beforehand. And I think the questions I came up with now seem trite and irrelevant because you transcended the kind of things I were thinking you were going to talk about. And so I'm sincerely blown away by the ways in which you've presented the topic today. Yeah.
I'd concur with your sentiments on that. I wanted to ask you a little bit about Tom Heatherwick's culpability in this whole thing, because for one kind of interpretation of that is that building has a kind of functional diagram for people to commit suicide, right? It's something to do with the cantilever, so on and so forth. But I'm wondering if there's something else that is to do with his, that his and other architects are classified as star architects, and the notion of the object, that it becomes somehow symbolizes or draws in acts of that thought. That's the first part of the question. The second is, if you were to work on that, is there like your work, is there a way in which the literary example of foreshadowing, is there any way that we can foreshadow our experiences of going into a Thomas Heatherwick building through design in a similar way? Do you think?
I mean, I think about that. I use the word simultaneous invention, right? So you look at something like Detroit 100 years ago, Henry Ford, the automobile, begets factory society. This is stuff David knows really well. And 100 years of Detroit ecology, the city builds up. It goes through this process of making, unmaking, and remaking, right? It's in a remaking moment right now. But what the simultaneous invention part is, Ford at the time thought he had a great idea, but it's simultaneously invented in a future near now, global climate change, right? So I think, I'm trying to, in my own work, be more acutely aware of how do you understand perspectives or maybe design intention other than your own in order to get at this other way of there's this confluence between the social media, the culture of self-imaging, the way that imaging culture upholds and normalizes and puts even more pressure on normative beauty. I mean, and for sure other kinds of beauty, but mostly normative beauty is caught up in the kind of selfie culture. There's very few people out there using the selfie as a kind of critical trope to re-image the human. And so I think it's this beautiful intersection of this idealized vessel that becomes a kind of self-obsession, right? Both in the architecture, but also in the self-obsession of oneself in comparison to other bodies, that I think draws together the kind of influencer model of that structure to such a degree that unfortunately people see it as a site to end their lives. I suspect that that's not the only building out there that's done that. Right? There's other buildings out there that have a preponderance of utility to assist in architecturally assisted suicide. So the Golden Gate Bridge, a friend of mine, Natalie Jeremijenko, earlier on in her career, put 2 motion cameras below the bridge, ran them for a month, documented something like 40 plus suicides that were not documented by the county. Right? So and I'm not, I don't speak lightly about suicide or suicide ideation and depression and things like that. I get that, but I think to go to your question, I think a lot of work out there is, I would call it pathographic space, not architectural space. I don't know if that got at your question, but
Yeah, it does. I mean, answers a lot. I mean, Tom Heatherwick recently has gained a lot of notoriety about railing against boredom in architecture. This is his new book that's come out recently,
Right.
which is, fundamentally that we should be less boring, and so he's advocating for beauty in a way, and I think that's very different from what you're describing.
yes, we are not aligned.
Yeah.
I want to ask a question about the distinction between aesthetics and tactics. You talked about disability aesthetics on the one hand and disability tactics on the other. And, to a certain extent, disability and its appearance in discourses on architecture sometimes comes with a moral imperative of
I know.
accessibility, right?
Yeah.
That sort of thing.
Right.
And those discussions often seem disconnected from the subjective realm of aesthetics, right? And so there's a provocative nature to involve aesthetics to begin with. You discussed, and this is kind of where I think I need clarification, you discussed aesthetics from the perspective of a normative body seeing a disabled identity across the street, and that's the aesthetic moment. And then tactics seemed, I think, to give it more agency. I'm not sure if that's totally your position, or if you think disability aesthetics
I think
has the
Yeah.
agency to begin with.
I think the dominant aesthetic discourse around disability is Virilio talks about is the aesthetics of disappearance, right? And how disabled bodies, but also other minoritized bodies, have been erased out of the cultural milieu, out of the cultural arena, out of public space, right? And rendered, had like systematically been disqualified. So I noted, I think I was looking at, Adobe has like a new AI engine out there, and the little promo image that they have, the scene is the seascape, there's a fence, the beautiful horizon, a sunny day, and there's just a child standing behind, in front of the fence looking at the horizon. Which if you were to look back at that child from the sea, you'd see a child behind bars. And then the AI algorithm is like object erasure. And so the way they demonstrate this is they remove the child figure and it automatically fills in with the context awareness of the environment, right? I just thought wow, that's really interesting. Like, did anybody think about what's going on here, right? That AI could be used to render an idealized scene that would intentionally scrub out a child as if they're not human, because they don't matter as much as the beautiful view from Thomas Heatherwick's flat in London. Right? That's the beauty he's into. It's not the beauty that's about kind of visceral reality. I think the aesthetics of violence, I think we can learn a lot from that space around the ethics of what's at stake for architecture.
So is a simplified version of that argument that the appearance of disability identities is a kind of ethical imperative, and that is the value itself, the kind of the appearance, against the disappearance of those identities.
Yeah, I mean, I think as my friend Taubman Sieber's right, he said whenever a disabled body moves into social civic space, it disrupts the social codes in that space, right? And the standards and things like that.
And so, one...
We should open.
Yeah,
it up.
we should, yes. Other questions? Yes.
Hi, you mentioned a few minutes ago about Henry Ford building Detroit.
I didn't say he built Detroit. He
Well,
automobile.
basically
but
he came up with the ideal of creating this factory, and then he created the housing around the factory in order to house the workers, and basically built the city. So you could say he built Detroit. But if you look at Detroit today, it is a disaster compared to...
No, I totally disagree with that kind of rhetoric. No, I don't think it's a disaster.
Okay, well, my question is this. currently, there are several large corporations, Tesla, Google, and Meta, that are building towns. They're building infrastructure. They're building urban cities from the scratch. The other thing that you've been in China, I know that China has 20 million new people every year that they have to build new cities for. Is there anything that we can do as part of making this huge network of cities that would enhance the disabilities that people have?
I think, I mean, to me, your question is really like, what's the role of the architect?
Yes.
Question?
Especially when it comes to
Right.
urban design.
I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I still feel like as a educator, teacher, I feel compelled to support a more diversified notion of practice than the convention of, working in the profession, which I think is perfectly fine. But I like thinking about the architect as a person who has a tremendous amount of intellectual dexterity that can move into other spaces and engage with other kinds of people in ways that the profession doesn't. Right? Just the ability to think through design and to have a spatial thinking mechanism, up here, differentiates you from 95% of the people out there, right? Who just rely on like inherent proprioception to figure out things. So I like thinking about, and this is happening with large organizations, they're hiring artists and creative people and architects not to just do the architecture in the conventional sense, but to rethink organizational structure. Like how do you enhance cognitive flow, but also de-stress, the worker? And I think like the cities that you're suggesting, I think a big part of why they make these experiments successful or not is how do they attend to infrastructure like health-related infrastructure. And I'm not talking about going for a jog around the lake kind of health infrastructure, but I'm really thinking about what's at stake in a moment where surveillance of our own biometric data is the thing that provides us higher degrees of access to increasingly more secure properties and domains, right? So you've got like 3-factor authentication protocol, something you know, something you have, and something you are. And that's increasing in its veracity. Like if you go to the airport, you more or less are willing, willfully have to submit to that. And when you cross borders, you willfully submit to that. And I think it'll be really interesting, like how that information will be data mined, optimized, who's part of the optimization process, and like all forms of optimization, someone decides, or AI decides, or an algorithm decides what counts and what doesn't count. And I want to make space for all the stuff that doesn't count to be in the model. And the cities you're referring to are absolute weapons of ableism and white patrimony, in addition.
We have time for a few more questions.
If your ramp became sort of an Instagram success where everybody wanted their picture taken in front of it, would you be offended? And then after the first kid tries to skateboard that ramp over the hyperbolic curve and dies, then would you be liable, or do you think you would be liable for having created the potential risk?
The project was never intended to be built. It's sort of beyond that. The project's value is in its influence and how it's changed people thinking. So I have no aspirations like, oh, I really want to build this thing. This project, and I think this could be a good sort of didactic lesson for some students. the way you put the work out there doesn't always mean it has to be built. There's plenty of work in the history of architecture that's theoretical, conceptual, representational, and it's had a huge influence on how people think about things, whether that's thinking about the city, thinking about architecture, thinking about how we live our lives. And so, you know, could I hold myself liable for an accidental death in this situation? Absolutely. Would I mind if people take selfies in front of it? I'm ambivalent. I'm more interested in the question like, what if it caught on? What if it scaled up? What if architecture was more responsive to human needs? So rather than, you know, coming into this awkward room, this is a great room, you know, on right-hand bias desks with a fold-out thing, these desks are all fixed, these chairs are all fixed, so you're all in on the crime right now, as am I, right? Like frontality, authoritarianism, I stood up to make that point, right? All those tropes of architecture are like completely embedded in this institution, like every institution. And I think that's the bigger question for me is like, how do you change institutional thresholds so they have, one, they can recognize the kind of heterogeneity of people working in your organization through its architecture. What do you think? Is that good?
Please join me in thanking Robert Adams for
There's
his
another
incredible lecture.
question back there.
We got one more? Yes, please.
So you mentioned how
Hi.
so you mentioned how a lot of the history of architecture is this theoretical work, and I think now more than ever we're kind of seeing how important it is to shift from that theoretical to the physical. So how do we start convincing the people who kind of make the decisions to build, the people that kind of make the decisions to create these codes that affect the rest of that affects how the cities and the urban fabric are being built? Because I think as like scholars, as architects, as the designers, we never really stop hoping that we are able to influence these sort of institutions that unfortunately are in control, you know, whether we want to be a part of it or not. You know, I think we can move from place to place, from country to country, but there's always going to be an institution to follow. How do we kind of transition from the theoretical to something that we can do and maybe be a part of that shift or that change?
It's a really good question. And just to be honest with you, I've never thought of myself as a theoretical architect. I'm not an architect. I do use theory, and I'm interested in theory, but that's not the primary motivation to do the work. So my motivation to do the work I do is invested in the making of things. And I love making things. I love using my hands in a range of tools. There's no tool or machine or kind of material that's off limits in our studio. And that gives me an immense amount of pleasure. I can learn a lot of things from people who are experts in making things. I was working with I consulted with the designers who do the X Games skateboard ramps, because we were thinking about this question of the skateboard surface and its resiliency, and, you know, could it also be used for skating and other things? And that was, you know, so enlightening. I learned a lot from different kind of paint coating people, but where I get my juice is through that making. And the people who've influenced me, they're also makers. And so your question around policy, that's not my question, but it's a good question you have. And so your question should be, how will you do that? What kinds of things will you have to know, and who do you have to be in communication with, you know, to do that kind of work? And I think there's a lot of opportunity for architects to collaborate with hundreds of NGOs around the country. There's all sorts of things like Centers for Independent Living. In Detroit, there's this phenomenal organization called Detroit Disability Power, DDP. And it is the most like intersectional, everybody's in that space, everybody's like doing work in that space, and they're doing things like changing policy. They're changing how our legislators think about the right to vote and the right to work. And so those are spaces that I could imagine you move into and do that work. I lost a friend this past summer, Robert Mangurian, who I worked with in Beijing at BASE. He passed away. And so this past weekend we had a memorial service for him at SCI-Arc where he taught. He was the graduate director there for many years. And I had to say a few words about, his influence on me. And so this is going to your question, like, who do you need to be engagement? Is it policymakers? Who are the people that influence you? How do you give back to those people? And grow that good energy that you bring to your work. And so his last lecture happened to be at Michigan, and I was with him, a group of students, not like unlike yourselves. And Robert, the elder, I used to call him, he said, "What's the most important thing you can design?" And, students said, "Well, you could design, lots of architects, they design a chair. It's like a thing to do. You design a chair. It's a good thing to design. Or you could design a building." And then he started, finishing the sentence. "You could design an opera. You could design a photo series. You could design a book. There's so many things you could design." But then he said, "What's the most important thing you could design? The most important thing that you could design is your life." If you kind of come to your education with that perspective, for me, when I heard that, I was like, wow. And the students heard that, and they felt so empowered by that, like, I'm going to design my life. I could change my behavior. I could change the way I think. And it's sort of for me, it just got me out of like this moment when I'm stuck in something. Like, just design yourself out of that situation. That was a kind of long, looping answer, because I don't know if I do think the NGO angle is a good angle to go into.
Please join me in thanking Robert Adams one more time.